There are 4 recurring themes in World History 10: globalization, hegemony, the quest for progress, and the struggle for change. We will be exploring political, economic, social, and intellectual movements from the 18th to the 21st century by looking at history through these 4 thematic lenses. Our first unit will be a brief review of the end of 9th grade and a critical evaluation of the benefits and detriments of globalization in the modern era. In its most simplistic definition, globalization is the process of interaction and integration of people, cultures, governments, and businesses of different nations. It is primarily motivated by the desire for and the sale of goods and services. It involves the movement of raw materials and goods, diversification of production of raw materials and products across distances, the movement and resettlement of peoples, and the integration of cultures and ideas. The process can be peaceful or violent, either through trade or conquest, or even a combination of both. And, to varying degrees, globalization has impacted the environment, local cultures, political systems, economic development, prosperity, technological development, and even human physical well-being. Today, globalization is a buzzword often debated in the news. However, it is not a new concept. For thousands of years, people across great distances have been buying from and selling to each other. For example, the silk, sand, and sea routes that you studied in 9th grade connected the Asian, African, and European continents. Some regions and empires prospered more than others. This depended on the availability of desired resources, access to capital and advanced technology, as well as location and geography. Some regions were dominated by others, while others shared a mutually beneficial relationship, be it through religion, trade, or government structure. Modern globalization finds its roots in the Age of Exploration and Christopher Columbus's accidental contact with and the subsequent European conquest of the Western Hemisphere. Traditionally, textbooks have portrayed a positive point of view of the Age of Exploration and Conquest. It represented the vantage point of the victorious conquerors, that is, the European nations that dominated North and South America from the 16th to the early 19th century. However, the 1990s marked the 400-year anniversary of this great European discovery, and with it came a bombardment of books about Columbus and the age of discovery and colonization. New documents and 20th century analysis gave rise to considerable debate about the merits and burdens of the legacy of explorers, conquistadors, and colonizers. This marked a major shift in the approach to and interpretation of this historical era, from that of the European perspective to that of inhabitants of the Americas themselves. According to the older textbooks, the discovery of the Americas was the story of the triumphant European Christian civilization over uncivilized pagan societies. It focused on the importance of the triangle trade, the Columbian exchange, the rise of European empires, and the taming of the wild, both human beings and the environment. However, the more recent perspective emphasizes the destructive side of European conquest. It focuses on the negative impact of the Columbian exchange, triangle trade, slavery, forced religious conversion, racism, wars of conquest, and wars of economic and political competition. Political activists, historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, scientists, and even artists have all contributed to the debate, and continue to do so. It has made reconciliation of these different viewpoints difficult. In these podcasts, you will be presented with 4 overarching themes of globalization. These podcasts are designed to present a variety of perspectives on historical evidence so that we can further analyze and evaluate the legacy of the Age of Exploration and Colonization. You have been given an accompanying guiding reading packet with select documents that correspond to each podcast. As you watch, take notes in the appropriate section of the packet, labeled Podcast Notes, leaving the remaining critical analysis and evaluation sections for class notes. Theme 1, Globalization, Movement of Raw Materials and Goods and Production of Goods. In the mid to late 15th century, European monarchs began to develop an interest in the world outside of the European continent. This is not to say that before the 1400s, Europeans were completely isolated from the rest of the world. In fact, starting with the Christian Crusades to reconquer the Holy Land in the 1100s, Europeans both battled against and traded with the Muslim world, which stretched across northern Africa, southwest Asia, southeastern Europe, and southern Asia. However, in the 1400s, there were 5 major factors that motivated Europeans to take to the sea to explore. First, by the middle of the 1400s, most of Europe was undergoing varying degrees of what we refer to as the Renaissance. Between the 14th and 17th century, Europe experienced a period of artistic, literary, and intellectual revival, or rebirth. This period can be seen almost as a transition period where European activity, society, politics, spirit, and attitudes began to shift away from the isolated and regional focus of feudalism and manorialism to empire building and global trade. This period marked the transition from the medieval to the modern world. Although the extent to which this factor is important as a motivation for exploration is debated, the willingness to experience, observe, and understand as much as possible was a fundamental philosophy and attitude of the Renaissance era. In other words, man's curiosity was a motivation. Second, the Crusades of the 14th and 13th century left feelings of hostility between Christians and Muslims. The First Crusade was only temporarily successful. All subsequent crusades failed to result in Christians regaining and maintaining control of the Holy Land. European monarchs and religious leaders believed they had a religious duty not only to continue fighting Muslims, but also to convert non-Christians throughout the world. Third, the Crusades also exposed Western Europeans to the luxuries and wealth of the Far East. Spices, textiles, and precious stones and metals, which were either unknown or limited in supply during the medieval era, were found in great supply in the Muslim world. As the middlemen of international trade, Muslims sat in the center of trade between Africa, China, India, and the Spice Islands of the Indian Ocean. The Italian city-states of southern Europe were perfectly situated in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. This prime geographic location enabled Italian merchants to control trade between Western Europe and the Muslim world. However, Western European monarchs wanted to bypass Italian and Muslim merchants. They wanted direct access to India and the trade of the Indian Ocean. This finally became possible with the development of new technologies and scientific discoveries, which is the next motivating factor. Fourth, in the late 1200s, advances in technology made the voyages of discovery possible. Voyages spanning 3,000 miles or more would have been impossible with medieval naval technology. The Portuguese, motivated by the desire to become part of international trade, were the leaders in navigational technology and techniques. New ships, new sails, new tools, new maps, and more accurate understanding of astronomy all contributed to the Portuguese dominating naval exploration from 1415 to the early 1500s. Lastly, as naval technology advanced and unknown continents and islands were charted, European monarchs began to recognize the political implication of the new markets, raw materials, and people they encountered. The idea that there was a much larger world at their disposal, ripe for the taking, naturally led to desire to conquer, colonize, and control a global empire. This attitude is even clearly and surprisingly held by Columbus himself. In his log, Columbus reflects on the indigenous Arawak peoples he encountered on his first voyage. He says, "They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they engaged for the glass beads and hawk bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They did not bear arms, and did not know them, for I showed them a sword, and they took the edge of it, and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men we could subjugate them all, and make them do whatever we want." Since Europe was a collection of politically competitive monarchies, this notion of empire building and control of massive immediate wealth in trade and precious metals appealed to all of the kings and queens of Western Europe. As one country grew in territory, trade, and wealth, their rivals raced to not be left out of the exploration and colonization game. By the 17th century, Portugal and Spain were no longer the sole competitors for global dominance. The Dutch, French, and English entered the race as well. Political rivalries and economic competition for resources, trade routes, and markets are very strong motivating factors. It is important to understand that all these factors directly impacted the movement of raw materials and goods, as well as the establishment of the production of goods. First, intellectual curiosity and the spirit of adventure gave individuals the courage needed to take a gamble on voyages and enterprises and make the needed sacrifices for successful economic ventures. We must remember these voyages and expeditions were, after all, financially and physically risky business ventures. Religious zeal and forced conversions by missionaries helped make it safe for colonists to settle and establish agricultural and trade enterprises. Missionaries traveled with explorers and conquistadors looking for souls to save. Once an area was cleared, either through conquest, pandemic, or conversion, the area was considered open and safe territory for settlers and entrepreneurs. Settlers followed the sword and the cross. Third, although the initial demand in Europe was for spices and luxury items of the Far East, the introduction of the resources of the Western Hemisphere expanded the variety of goods available and shifted demand and production. Portugal dominated trade with the Far East and controlled trade around the Horn of Africa. But Columbus's discovery in the Western Hemisphere resulted in the immediate influx of massive amounts of gold and silver into the Spanish treasury. Eventually, Spain realized that this supply of precious metals was not endless, and settlers and merchants began to establish more long-term means of obtaining wealth. At first, settlers looked to the resources available in the New World to reproduce and sell to the Old World: tobacco, cocaine, pitch, tar, lumber, fish, furs. Settlers soon realized that the climate and environment of the Caribbean islands and certain areas of South America were ideal for growing two profitable luxury crops, sugar and coffee, and settlers began to establish large plantations to grow cash crops to sell to European markets. Not to mention the introduction of pigs, goats, sheep, cattle, and the extremely important honeybee. At the same time, Europeans back in the Old World discovered that plants indigenous to the New World were easy to grow and had great caloric and nutritional value. Tomatoes and potatoes soon became staples in the European diet, and this nutritional revolution was not only for humans. Corn became a staple in livestock feed on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. And fourth, technological advances in navigation directly aided in the obvious transportation of goods, resources, and people. However, technological developments did not end there. The introduction of horses and oxen as sources of power and transportation transformed agricultural production in the New World. The introduction of simple machines, especially those that employed the use of the wheel, had a massive impact on mill production and transportation. While the wheel was known in Mesoamerica, it was primarily used in toys. In addition, iron was the metal that had the biggest impact on the Americas. And, of course, the introduction of cheap paper, the alphabet, the arch, and gunpowder all assisted in helping European settlers transform the New World. This cross-Atlantic swapping of plants, animals, technology, and not to mention deadly disease is usually referred to as the Columbian Exchange. This is not to be confused with the Triangle Trade. Conquest of the Western Hemisphere required men, money, and might. Once obtained, monarchs wanted to protect their financial and political investments and secure these colonies as viable, productive parts of the empire. They needed to protect the production and movement of goods. To do so, monarchs implemented a new economic system called mercantilism. Mercantilism is the theory that a country can increase its power by increasing the amount of gold and silver it has through careful, strict government regulation. The specific focus of this regulation is to create a favorable balance of trade. This means that a country wants to export more goods than it imports. It tries to do this in two ways. One, by establishing complete control over an international good, either through foreign trading companies that have monopolies over trade in a region, or by dominating the production of that good. Two, by making the country self-sufficient. This is where the importance of an empire comes into play. Colonies become the suppliers of raw materials, and the mother country becomes the center of manufacturing and international trade. In order to ensure that entrepreneurs and merchants act in accordance with the vision of the monarch and don't go rogue for self-interest and profit, the monarchs put heavy regulations on what can be made, where and by whom, what can be sold, where and by whom, and what can be bought, where and by whom. It does this through heavy tariffs on imported goods, a powerful navy that polices the trade routes, and a colonial government with officials it can trust. By the end of the 18th century, global trade had completed a seismic shift away from what it had looked like in the 15th century. Instead of the Islamic world and Italian city-states being the center of international trade between China, India, the Spice Islands, Africa, and Europe, Western European nations now dominated and expanded international markets. Global trade now included two new continents for sources of raw material and agricultural goods. New products and new trade centers were introduced and firmly established in the international market. Production in Europe shifted from the local self-sufficiency of the feudal manor to a web of regional centers that focused on raw materials, mining, agriculture, milling, refining, and trade. All Western European nations that had colonies in the Western Hemisphere engaged in mercantilism to varying degrees and experienced varying degrees of success. And, unfortunately, a large part of that success depended not only on the strength of its military, but also on the relocation and systematic control of peoples. Which brings us to the second theme of globalization, the movement and resettlement of peoples, which we will cover in the next podcast.